All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for carving out some time for us to spend together here today. My name is Ted Harrington, and what I'm here to do today is to try to teach you some methods and hopefully change the way that we think about how we actually find security vulnerabilities. So I'm going to be sharing with you some insights from a book that I've written that is about to come out in a few months. The book is called Hackable. Everything we're going to talk about today is in that book, as well as, of course, many other ideas. But what I'm hoping to do today is to equip you with things that you can go take action on. So let's go get started on that mission, and hopefully I'm able to do exactly that. So let's share some slides here. Okay, I wrote this book called Hackable for the sole reason that I see the same problems continue to manifest themselves, continue to present themselves day in and day out by the people who are responsible for making sure that your technology is secure. Now, I wrote this in the context of application security. That's one of the areas that the consulting firm that I'm one of the partners in, that we focus on a lot, is application security. But so many of these principles apply to all of the other security domains as well, whether it's network security or the human element, such as social engineering, etc. But I did decide to focus on application security because I see these challenges every day where organizations, they're struggling to build a piece of software that is going to change the market or the industry, or in grand senses, the world. Yet security has really become a core requirement of what that product actually has to be. And yet in many cases, it becomes a preventative mechanism, right? It gets in the way of being able to go to market. It is something that many customers of your company are now asking hard questions about. And quite frankly, the element of the developers that many organizations, although security is important to them and they spend a lot of time understanding the concepts, it's really not the center of their training. And then on the other side of the sort of competitive landscape, you've got attackers who spend every waking moment of what they're doing, every waking moment of their days, thinking about how to break systems. And so it really is this uneven playing field, and many organizations are struggling with how to deal with that. Then the final solution, the final outcome of that, I should say, is that I see organizations try to solve all those problems in ways that actually aren't effective. So we're going to dive into some of the elements of that problem set. Certainly, it's a very complex problem. There's very many elements to it. I mean, that's why I wrote a book about the challenges. But we're going to focus today on this idea around what security testing really is. And that's why the title of this talk is Your Pen Test Isn't a Pen Test. Because in many cases, what people think they're getting when they get a penetration test is actually not a penetration test. And we'll talk about that, and then I'll hopefully replace that with a method. So let's talk about injecting drugs into your spine. A few years ago, I found myself in the boardroom with the CEO, CTO, and members of the development team for one of our customers. And this company was building a medical device, and we were there to talk about the results of a security assessment that we had performed on their behalf. And we had looked at, of course, the software, the firmware that operates on the device, and we've been looking at all these ways where an attacker might be able to actually manipulate the device in ways that could hurt patients. Now, we were going through the results and actually walking the CEO and his team through how the attack might actually play out. And the CEO interrupts us. And he says, well, even though what you're saying could happen, I'm just not that worried about it. Now, we, of course, just shared with him how you might actually hurt somebody by exploiting this vulnerability. So we encouraged him to elaborate. And he says this, and to this day, I will never forget this answer. He says, let me put it this way, Ted. He says, I drive a BMW. I love that car. I never want to see it get scratched. Theoretically, someone could haul a piano up onto the roof of our office building, throw that piano off the roof onto my BMW, and completely destroy the car. Theoretically, that could happen, but I'm just not that worried about it. Now, I am quite literally in the profession of seeking the unexpected, and that surprised even me. I mean, here was a guy who had been demonstrated the ways that an attacker could actually hurt patients as a result of attacking this device, and his response was to dismiss them. Now, unfortunately, we couldn't turn his thinking on this around, and when he went to go try and get approval from the government agency that approves use of medical devices on patients, they were actually denied because the security there were just so many problems with the security, and they didn't like his attitude, the way he was very dismissive of security concerns. And it was a really sad story because since they couldn't get approval, they of course couldn't sell their solution, and because they couldn't sell their solution, they wound up going out of business. Now, it brings me no joy to relive that story other than the part that's kind of funny about the throwing the piano off a roof, but it brings me no joy I'm certainly not celebrating an entrepreneurial failure. I'm an entrepreneur myself, and I want to celebrate entrepreneurial success. But I feel that a cautionary tale like this does actually need to be told because it all comes down to mindset. That particular CEO, he had the wrong mindset about how to actually find and fix his security vulnerabilities, right? He didn't want to fix the issues, so he didn't fix the issues, and so they didn't actually get fixed. And even though that seems like such a straightforward and obvious concept, like you have to want to get better in order to get better, you'd be surprised how many organizations actually approach security as something that can, in fact, be dismissed, as an expense that can be minimized, as something that can be sort of automated and ignored, but you're never going to achieve excellence by doing it that way. So let's talk about how you do achieve security excellence. And once we have that right mindset of wanting to actually find the issues and fix them, which, sort of the contrasting view from what our the CEO friend that I just mentioned, the way he lived. The way that you do this is you need to actually find these vulnerabilities. You need to fix them. You need to understand how severe they are. Not all vulnerabilities are the same. Some are really catastrophic and you need to address right now. And some you can certainly put off to later. So that leads to this idea of security testing. The term is security assessment, and that's sort of the umbrella term for all types of security testing. But not all terms are created equal. Not all terms are the same thing, yet in a modern context, all the time these terms are being interchanged when they shouldn't be. The term you're probably most familiar with, and it's the reason that it's in the title of this talk, is penetration testing. Now here's what's crazy. Most organizations, when they want to find their vulnerabilities, when they want to do security testing, they typically ask for penetration testing. However, commonly what's being sold is something different, is vulnerability scanning. Yet what they actually need is a third thing altogether, which is vulnerability assessments. These are three remarkably different things. They have remarkably different outcomes. They have remarkably different approaches. They require different levels of investment of time and effort and money. And yet people interchange these terms all the time. They shouldn't. So let's examine what each of these things are. Penetration testing is a highly tactical service for a very well-hardened system. So if you can imagine something that you believe can stand up to a nation-state attack, that is when a penetration test makes a lot of sense. Penetration testing really only has a binary outcome. It's yes or no, right? You set a goal to say, can X happen? Yes or no. And that's it. Those are really the only outcomes. It doesn't, the point of a penetration test, of what a proper penetration test is, isn't actually to identify all the different vulnerabilities that might exist, isn't to assign severity to them and give you a triaged way, or a way to triage how to approach fixing them. It's just to determine did or did not succeed. I'm a big believer in metaphors to try to explain the many complexities in security. And I think a metaphor for penetration testing is that we could go to a non-information security example and go back to the days when Navy SEAL Team 6 went on a mission to take out Osama bin Laden. Now, they had a singular mission: capture or kill bin Laden. The only outcome, there was only one outcome, or there was only one answer to the outcome, and it was yes or no, whether or not they achieved that mission. Nothing else mattered after the fact. So once they actually succeeded in the mission, and if you didn't catch the headlines, they did succeed in that mission. Once they succeeded in the mission, it didn't matter what other weaknesses there might have been in bin Laden's compound. It didn't matter what weaknesses there might have been in tunnels or doors or windows or roof entrances or anything like that. None of that really matters after the mission has been determined to be a success or a failure. That's really what penetration testing is like. It's sort of this do or die mission. At the end, you either say yes or no, we achieve the mission, and you move on. Now, that's what penetration testing actually is. But what's often being presented as penetration testing is something different. It's vulnerability scanning. Vulnerability scanning is essentially taking a tool that in an automated fashion looks for common issues. It looks for, say, whether whether patches have not been implemented or whether known vulnerabilities might exist in this particular technology. It's quick, it's easy, it's inexpensive, but it's not the same thing as a penetration test. The metaphor here would be, it's kind of like walking through a metal detector at the airport. So if you think about how crazy that is side by side, right? Someone is saying, I want Navy SEAL Team 6, and they're being given a walk-through metal detector. A metal detector is good against some obvious basic issues. It catches bulky weapons, bulky metal weapons, things like that, but it's not really effective against even mildly sophisticated attempts, and it's certainly not going to catch something like, the most wanted person on earth. Those two things are really in stark contrast, right? And yet there's this third thing altogether that is actually what organizations typically need. Now, I'm generalizing here. Not everybody always needs vulnerability assessments all the time. But in most cases, in my experience, when people are asking for penetration testing, they actually are looking for is vulnerability assessments. Because here's what vulnerability assessments do. Vulnerability assessments help you identify all of the different issues that you have, right? They help you understand how severe those issues are so that you can now prioritize how to fix them. It gives you, as a result, a plan for how you can improve the security overall, how you can get better. That is really what most people are looking for when they're looking for security testing. How do I make sure that I can identify my issues, I can fix them, and I can ultimately be better? And for your customers, for companies who are asking their suppliers to get penetration testing done, this is actually what they're looking for, right? They're not looking for the do or die mission. They're looking for, hey, prove to me that the thing is secure. And that includes not only find the issues, but also make the solution better. And so the metaphor for vulnerability assessments is where, unlike Navy SEAL Team 6 out on its do or die mission, and unlike walking through a metal detector, this is more like the training for those Navy SEALs, right? So when someone wants to become a Navy SEAL, they're already tough as nails, right? They're already a total badass of a warrior. And what they do is they go to this training that's not too far from my home here in San Diego that helps them become elite. It takes their physical stamina and improves it. It takes their mental stamina and improves it. It improves their leadership skills. It essentially takes these individuals that are already great and makes them better. And as a result, then they can go on these do or die missions. And in many ways, that's sort of what vulnerability assessments are like. They're great for both systems that are not very well hardened yet, all the way through to systems that are extremely thoroughly tested. And ultimately what it does is it helps you find all your issues, rank them by priority, and ultimately get better. So you're asking for penetration testing, commonly being sold vulnerability scanning, when actually what you need are vulnerability assessments. So what should you do with this information, right? Am I suggesting that you should pull out some flashcards and memorize terms? No, I don't think that would actually be a good use of your time or really anybody's time. Not because it's not good to know the terms. As a matter of fact, I wish that everybody would use the right terms for the right things. But more because even if you walk away from this talk and you start using the right terms, other people won't. And so what you actually need to do is you need to think about the goal. You need to be approaching security from the perspective of what is the goal. And then when you start with the goal, you can work backwards to what do you actually need. So if you have a hardened system, it's very mature, it's been through a lot of testing, and you want to determine, can it be broken? Can it stand up in that simulated attack scenario? That's when you get a penetration test. Your goal is you need a quick, inexpensive check for common issues, then that's when you want to get your vulnerability scanning. If you want to actually improve the solution overall by finding your different vulnerabilities, ranking them by severity, and then having that plan for how to fix them and when to fix them, that's when you want to get your vulnerability assessment. So this is what you need to take away from this idea, right? Start with the goal, understand what you want to achieve, and make sure that whatever the approach is that you're implementing actually aligns to that goal. Now, let's talk about a method to this madness. Okay, so let's say we're in agreement that what you probably are needing is a vulnerability assessment, and of course, there are those other scenarios where maybe that's not right for you. But in either sense, there is a method to the madness for how you actually go about finding vulnerabilities, and that's what I want to share with you now. How do you go about doing this? The first thing that you need to do, there's so many elements to this, but I'm going to simplify it to just one when it comes to how do you approach it, and then we'll get into the actual elements to the method. And the approach is this: you need to think like an attacker, right? You need to adopt that adversarial mindset. So what does that mean? What does it mean to think like an attacker? What that means is that a normal user is going to look at a system and understand the way that it's supposed to work and what the rules are, and try to essentially follow those rules and use the system the way that it's intended. That's not how attackers think. Attackers do the first part. They definitely also want to understand how the system is supposed to work. They want to understand how what the normal use case is. But then they try to make the system do something different. It's as simple as that. Understand how it's supposed to behave, make it behave differently. So let me explain this idea with a story. A few years ago, I was at a bar that's not too far from my house that is one of my favorite bars. And on this particular night that I showed up to enter this bar, I noticed there was a very, very long line and a cover charge of $20 once you wait through this long line just to get in. Now, I wanted nothing to do with either of those things. You've probably all been in this scenario too, right? Where you want to go to some bar and you see this scenario like what you see on screen. No one wants to deal with that. So what I did was I applied that attacker mindset to say, how can I make this system behave differently? How can I actually attack it? So here's what I did. Now, of course, what I'm going to describe is not a technical exploit. This is more an example of social engineering. But all of the principles apply exactly the same to your application, to your network, whatever it is that you're trying to secure. And so the first thing that I did was I understood the system, right? I understood that there was authentication and authorization, right? Certain people had certain privileges and were allowed to do certain things, and they needed to prove who they were and that they were allowed to have those privileges. So specifically by that, I mean there was a VIP list. And if you're on the VIP list, you didn't have to wait in line, you didn't have to pay cover. So my challenge was, how do I get them to believe that I'm on that VIP list when I'm not on the VIP list? So here's what I did. I strolled right up to the VIP hostess, and with an air of confidence, I just said, "Hi, I'm on the list." Now, I wasn't on the list. So when she asked me, "Great, what's your name?" giving her my name was not going to accomplish the goal. So what I needed to do was I needed to extract some information from her so that I could make her believe that I was in fact a privileged user, that I was on that list. So I delivered a form of questions that can be described as specially crafted inputs. And this is what any attacker does to any system, specially crafted inputs. So in this case, my specially crafted inputs was vague questions designed to elicit information. And so rather than giving her my name, I just said, I'm with the group. Now, I wasn't with the group. So when she asked me, which group? Just guessing a group's name was probably going to fail and wasn't going to help me. So what I needed to do was I needed her to tell me what the groups were. And so my specially crafted input to that was, I'm with the big group. Now, I took a gamble. I assumed there were some groups larger than others. And with that, she looks down at her clipboard, she flips through a couple pages, and she says, the Smith Party. Bingo. I said, yes, I'm with the Smith Party. And with that, she opens the velvet rope, escorts me past the line, past the cashier, and I was in the bar. That's how I defeated the system. I defeated the system by having a goal. I knew that I wanted to escalate my privileges from a normal user to a privileged user, to the VIP, to a patron who has VIP access. I knew that I needed to issue these specially crafted inputs in order to get the system to behave differently. The VIP hostess job, her entire purpose, is to let the right people in, which is not me, and to keep the right people out, which was me. And so I was able to change that by looking at how the system works and making it behave differently. And so everything we're going to talk about next, as I lay out the fundamentals to this method, that is the mindset that you have to realize is woven into all of this. We're looking at how's the system supposed to work, and how do we make it do something different? So there are many elements to this system, to this method, and to this approach. The first is you need to analyze the design. So by this, I mean you need to understand, how is the system built? Who's it built for? How are privileges provisioned? What are the workflows? But one of the real big things here is, what's the purpose of this system? Because that directly influences the threat model, it influences why someone might want to attack, it influences what an attack scenario might look like. You could have two systems that are ostensibly built with similar functionality, but if one of them serves, say, the movie business, and one of them serves healthcare, those are really, really, really different. And attackers are going to attack in different ways. They're going to be used in different ways. And it's important to understand that, because weaknesses will manifest themselves differently based on how the system's built, who it's built for, and how it's used. So even though that might sound really straightforward, right? In order to find weaknesses, you need to understand the design. You'd be surprised how many organizations actually skip this step. And this is evidence when we get to the next rung of the method here, which has to do with running scanners. We talked before about vulnerability scanning. Vulnerability scanning does have a really important role in any sort of security testing methodology, because it quickly and inexpensively helps you find the proverbial low-hanging fruit, right? You can find the common issues quickly. But the real reason why you want this is that this is the first thing the attacker is going to do as well. You want to see what the attacker is going to see. But here's what's crazy. I just mentioned how analyzing design is a really important step. Scanners don't really care about the design. They don't have to. What a scanner does is it automatically is going through a series of steps looking for certain signatures or fingerprints to help it. It's essentially looking for things that it knows is that identifies a common issue, right? And it doesn't matter if that particular system helps healthcare or helps the movie business or whatever the business is. That's where it doesn't matter. A scanner doesn't care. But when we get to later stages, you'll find you absolutely do need to care how the system is supposed to work. Now, on this same level is this idea of looking for known vulnerabilities. Known vulnerabilities are things that commonly impact other systems. You might be familiar with something like OWASP Top 10. The OWASP Top 10 is a listing of the most common vulnerabilities that impact web applications. And it's a really, really great resource. And it's a great resource not just for security professionals, but for attackers too, right? Because they can look at something like that and they can make this assumption. Well, if most applications or most systems has this type of issue, that's probably where I should start checking on my target system. Because they're just like you, they're just like me, they're just like any of us. They want to get the best return on investment of their time and effort and money. And so the lowest hanging fruit is going to be where they know that people commonly make mistakes. So let's look for those first. Now, some of these you can find with an automated tool. That's where a scanner might help you. And some of them you actually need to find manually. But the point is, you have to look for those common issues. That's an important step. Now, the next step is actually not a step. It is a barrier between the stuff that comes next that is where the really important elements of your testing happen. And I refer to this as a capability gap. Capability gap is this idea that certain capabilities, and I mean both skills of a human as well as limitations of tools, can only go so far, right? And as we get into the higher order items, you're going to need elements that are heavily manual, that rely on experience and expertise. And certain individuals and certain tools just can't get there. Capability gap is kind of like the Grand Canyon, right? You're on one rim of the Grand Canyon, you can't get to the other rim of the Grand Canyon. And that's the idea here, that you can't just run a scanner, as an example, in order to find the things we're going to talk about in a moment. And the reason that I mentioned that is that that's actually what a lot of security testing is it's running of scanners. And that's okay if you have, say, a low-risk scenario, or maybe your assets aren't of a very high value, or you're just, the primary attackers aren't interested in you, whatever the reason, okay, that makes sense. But if you have valuable assets to protect, or security is a priority for your organization, a scanner alone is not going to get you there. So let's talk about where the rubber really hits the road. The real important stuff that comes in your security testing is what comes after the capability gap. The first one is functionality abuse. So to abuse functionality is to take the way that a system works and use the feature set against itself. Like I mentioned before, I'm a believer in metaphors and stories to try to convey some of these complex topics. So I will relate to you a story of a very smart security person that I know who really demonstrated functionality abuse when he was in high school. And he tells a story about how in his high school cafeteria there was a vending machine. Now, I'm pretty sure we all know what vending machines are, but just so I don't leave anybody behind, a vending machine is, of course, one of those machines that you put a dollar bill or coins or whatever in, and there's candy or snacks in there, and once you put in the dollar bill, it gives you can select your treat and have your treat. So here's the way that it's supposed to work. You're supposed to be able to put your bill in the little mechanism that receives the bill, and that mechanism verifies that this is, of course, legitimate currency. It verifies the denomination of the currency, and then it allows you to select your treat. Well, this friend of mine, he wanted a lot of treats, but he didn't have a lot of money. So the challenge question for him was, how can I get a lot of treats using the single bill that I have? So it turns out that here's how the system actually works. Of course, it ingests the bill the way that I described a moment ago, but there was no mechanism to prevent the bill being pulled back out through that ingest mechanism. So all that this guy had to do was figure out a way to do that. So here's what he did. He attached a piece of dental floss to the bill, puts the bill in, the machine registers the payment as received, he picks his stack, and then with the dental floss, he pulls the bill right back out. And just like that, he could get an unlimited amount of candy and treats. Now, I don't even need to go talk to a single manufacturer of vending machines, and I can tell you this with 100% certainty. That is not the way they intended the system to work. They did not intend the functionality of that bill mechanism to work that way, but it did. That's why abusing functionality is really important, is that as we build things, we intend it to work in a certain way, but the malicious folks out there, they're looking at how can it be used differently. So let's take this idea and apply it to a technical exploit. There's a really famous game hacker who goes by the pseudonym Manfred. And for a couple decades, Manfred made his entire living hacking online games. And what he would essentially do is he would abuse the way that the in-game banking systems handled currency. Now, if you're not familiar with online games, essentially the idea is this. Many of them have this idea of a currency in the game, right? You can accumulate it either by performing certain activities, or you can buy it. And what you do with this currency is then you exchange it for certain things to enhance the gameplay. So you might get a skills upgrade, you might buy a weapons upgrade, you might pay for access to a secret level. Whatever it is, you accumulate this currency in order to change elements of the game. Now, I'm oversimplifying the way that it works, but essentially this is the idea that these in-game banking systems, they would do a computation of what your account balance is, the amount you need to withdraw in order to get the upgrade or whatever it is that you're buying, and then the result is the new balance. So for example, you might have 500 coins, you won't need to take out 100 coins in order to buy that thing, and you're left with 400 coins. So what Manfred would abuse is the functionality in this essentially computation and attack the assumption of how integers are treated. So what he was able to do is exploit a pretty trivial vulnerability that enabled him to input negative numbers where the system anticipated positive numbers. So for example, he might say, instead of 500 coins minus 100 coins, it's 500 coins minus negative 100 coins. Now, as we all learned in middle school, subtraction of a negative number is addition. So what he was able to do is he was able to actually increase his account balance and get the upgrade that was the subject of the transaction. And he could do this an unlimited amount of times and accumulate just a mind-boggling amount of this in-game currency. And then there are these secondary markets where he could actually sell that currency to other players for real money. Just like with the vending machines, I can tell you without needing to talk to a single person that works at the particular game company that this research was done for, they did not intend the game to work this way. In fact, what this particular company did, and many companies in the online game sphere do, is they invested a tremendous amount of effort in mechanisms to prevent tampering just like this. And they were so confident in their methods to prevent tampering that they never actually got to this level of security testing. They never actually tried to abuse their own functionality. And for that reason, this particular exploit sequence existed for years and years and years and years, completely undetected. That's why a functionality abuse, why you really need to abuse functionality. This is why it matters, because the bad guys are going to do it. And so you need to do it as well. There's no tool that can help you do this. There's no way to scan for this. There's just no automation. You need to do it manually, and it needs to be done by somebody who has the experience and expertise to be able to do this. The next step in the method is to chain exploits. So chaining exploits is the idea where you take two things and you combine them in order to magnify the impact. When I was a kid growing up, there was another kid in my neighborhood who had a trampoline. And I was there all the time. I mean, what little boy doesn't love jumping on trampoline? And in fact, little kid, not even little boys, like every little kid loves jumping on a trampoline. So I was there all the time. And I remember vividly the day that we discovered the idea of the double jump. The double jump is the idea that if we time it so that my friend's jump is he's landing right as I'm taking off, his downward velocity actually magnifies my upward velocity. And we discovered this because all of a sudden I get shot ridiculously high, way higher than I ever have done on my own. I wind up hitting these trees that are hanging, over the trampoline. I experienced a moment of weightlessness, and then I came speeding back down to earth. And I thought I was going to die on the way down. Obviously, I didn't. Here I am with you guys today. But that day has stayed with me all these years later because it was such a vivid demonstration of this idea of chaining, of taking two things that as individually have only so much impact, but together have really exponential impact. So let's talk about this in terms of a technical exploit. There was a security assessment that at our consulting firm we recently finished that discovered a combination of issues. And it was really interesting because of the outcome of these issues. The first issue was an information leakage issue. That term essentially means that the system is giving up information that it probably shouldn't. Now, that in of itself isn't necessarily a terrible thing. You don't want it to happen, but it's not really catastrophic. What the information leakage here was that the system would tell any user the user identifier for any other user. Again, not a big deal, but still something that the system shouldn't do. The next vulnerability we discovered was much more significant, and that its authorization was broken. Now, what this meant was that the way to change the password was, it worked in a way that it shouldn't have. So we've all changed passwords before, and usually the way that it works is to change your password. It says, enter the current password, and then enter the new password, and enter the new password again. That current password piece is kind of an important element. There needs to be a level to verifying that this person is in fact authorized to make this change. Well, in this case, the way the system handled this was it didn't require any of that. All that it required in order to change the credentials was the user ID. Now, on its own, if you don't have the user ID, you can't change the credential. But if you take these together, you can get the user ID because of the information leakage issue. And when you pair these two problems together, the result is complete account takeover. This means that any user could take over the account of every single other user in the entire system, including the admin users. That means that an attacker, once they are a user of the system, they could do anything they want to the system or with the system. They could create malicious users, they could delete users, they could access sensitive data or other content. Anything that anyone could do in the system, they could do. This is the stuff that people dread in the idea of these of systems that have sort of shared tendencies, right? Multiple users of a similar system, and this is an example of why that's a problem. This scenario is not possible if you do not chain these exploits together. But if you chain these exploits together, it winds up with the worst case possible scenario for this particular solution. There's no tool for this. Can't automate this. It needs to be done manually by someone who has the experience and the skills to do so. Finally, the absolute pinnacle of security testing is looking for the unknown unknowns. So we've probably all heard the incredibly trite phrase, paraded out at some point, where someone says some version of, I don't know what I don't know, and that's what keeps me up at night. Now, it's played out, it's overused, but the concept, the underlying idea there is true, and that is really one of the primary things that as security professionals we're all trying to solve for, right? We're all trying to solve this challenge that when people are trying to make sure the technology they're building is secure, but they don't necessarily know what they don't know. I was working with a CTO recently who I've never heard somebody put it this way, and I thought it was hilarious. And he said it to me like this. He says, Ted, I'm afraid of a monster. I don't know what the monster looks like. I don't know what the monster wants, but I don't want the monster to bite me in the butt. Can you help me make sure I don't get bitten in the butt by this random monster? I'm like, yeah, okay, that works. I actually definitely understand what you're saying. And he's putting it in a very human and relatable way, but that's what the idea of looking for unknown unknowns is about. There's sort of three ways you can think about unknowns, or think about the condition of what known even is. A known is the things that you know about. So the outcome of any of your security testing, those vulnerabilities, that's a known. You know about it, you can do something about it. The second condition is known unknowns. So these are things that are known to exist, but you don't know if they impact you. So common vulnerabilities is an example that, like we talked about before, but a metaphor might be something like, when you're flying, we can all remember what that was like to actually go to airports and travel. When you're flying, the reality exists of flight cancellations, but you don't necessarily know if it's going to impact you. Unknown unknowns are things that are so unpredictable, you can't even necessarily account for them. And a metaphor for that might be like the world we live in right now in quarantine, right? Who could have anticipated that someone eats a bat and as a result, the economy collapses? I couldn't have, Unknown unknowns are things that we absolutely need to account for. And there's essentially three types of these unknown unknowns. The first is novel versions of common vulnerabilities, right? So common vulnerabilities are things like cross-site scripting is a common vulnerability, impacts a lot of web applications as an example. And so that's a known issue, but how that issue manifests itself in your system is potentially unique or new, something that no one's ever seen before and how it might be taken advantage of. And those are the kinds of unknown unknowns that you need to understand and look out for. We won't go into too much depth into that or into the second type, but they are both worth mentioning. And that's the second type is, of course, O-days in the supply chain. 0 days, that is 0-day vulnerabilities. Those are catastrophic vulnerabilities that are exploitable in the wild right now. And this is things, what the supply chain is any dependencies that your solution has. So maybe you're building something that leverages a cloud platform, or maybe you're leveraging a third-party library, or you're integrating with a payment card provider of some sort. Those are the types of things that vulnerabilities in those other providers could potentially impact you. And dealing with that is its own presentation. You deal with that through Defense in Depth. We need another 45 minutes to talk about that. So we won't go into that into too much depth, but that's another type of unknown you need to account for. The one we will talk about in greater depth is this idea of previously unknown attack methods. So this is where an attacker invents some new way to exploit a system that hasn't necessarily been seen either ever or isn't seen very common. To demonstrate this, we can talk about one of my favorite terms ever, request smuggling, which is just a hilarious and awesome term that I love. We can talk about request smuggling because this is a great example of a previously unknown attack method. So here's essentially what request smuggling is. First, let's talk about the way that solutions are built. So in the example of a web application, web apps, they handle a lot of traffic, a lot of requests. And there's essentially two ways to handle all that traffic. One way is to build one very expensive server to handle all of it. The other way is to build multiple inexpensive servers and then have a load balancer essentially be the traffic cop that sends the different requests to different servers. The second way, using a load balancer, is the way that is more commonly the better business decision, not in all cases, but in most cases. So what happens as a result is now you actually have two pieces of software running. You've got the web server software and you've got the load balancer software. Now they're supposed to be designed and implemented in the same way, but where there are discrepancies, it can be exploited. So for example, let's say there is a difference in how these two pieces of software treat when a request doesn't match a format, right? Let's say it's supposed to match a certain format and it doesn't quite meet that format. If one of them is overly permissive, meaning it says, this doesn't match, I'll let in anything that doesn't match. And if the other one says, this doesn't match, I'm going to reject anything that doesn't match. That misalignment of how the two implementations are set up, that can be exploited. So what an attacker would essentially do is would pair a malicious request with a legitimate request. It would be treated by the system as a single request, but then ultimately delivered and served up as two requests, including one of which being the malicious request. We've seen examples of this where an attacker could change the password, change usernames, could delete accounts, delete data. I mean, basically all the bad case, worst case scenario action someone could do from the outside without any authentication, right? And that's, of course, pretty bad. So when you look at something like this attack technique, from the moment from when it first became possible to the moment when it was first documented in security literature, that was about 15 years. 15 years this attack technique existed and no one knew about it. Then from that moment, another 16 years brings us to modern day, and most people still don't even know about this, let alone know how to look for it. This is incredibly specific to the way that your system is architected and implemented. There's no tool that can help you look for something like this. You need to do it manually, and it needs to be by somebody who has the experience and skill to know how to look for something like this. So there you have the method, right? These are the elements to how you actually find those vulnerabilities so you can fix them, so that you can prioritize what to do next. And the beauty is when you do these things, it gives you a competitive advantage, because now not only do you build a better, more secure solution, you're actually able to use that in your marketing, right? You're able to go to your customers and say, hey, we're more secure, and I'm going to show you how. And we're more secure than all of our competitors, because they're not doing this method that we're doing. They're doing just the stuff below the capability gap, right? But the key here is you need to do all of it. This, of course, assumes that you have something worth protecting. If you don't have something worth protecting, I don't imagine that you would attend a talk like this. So I'm making an assumption, and if that assumption is wrong, then this element doesn't apply to you. But if you have something worth protecting, you need to do all of this. But you need to be aware that what people usually today are calling penetration testing, which is something else, you're really only getting one subset of this whole approach. As we wrap up here, I wanted to encourage you to get your hands on the book that I have coming out. And I do this simply to say that all these ideas that we talked about, they're in this book. There's more ideas too. This is just one subset. Obviously, it's not enough time to present an entire book for you. But this book was written specifically to solve these types of problems. And if this resonates with you, please feel free to go read. So as we wrap up and transition to taking questions, I pass the baton to you, right? Ideas are only as good as the action that you take upon them. So go take action. And I would encourage a few discrete actions that you can go take today. Action number 1, go verify that you're actually doing security testing, right? Verify that you are actually engaging in an approach to find those vulnerabilities, to fix them, to build a better, more secure solution. Now, I don't care if you hire my company or someone else's company. That's not the point. The point is hire a company. And the second call to action here is make sure that whoever it is that you do hire, that the approach and the methodology aligns to the goal, right? So as we talked about at the top of this, you might be asking for penetration testing, but you presented something different. Make sure that you have clarity on what you're trying to achieve. Communicate that to whoever your security partner is that you're going to be working with. And make sure that no matter what term they use, that the actual approach and methodology aligns to what you need to accomplish. Make sure that you're getting that competitive edge by building a better, more secure solution your customers want to buy. And then, of course, the third and final call to action is, let me help you. Engage with me, connect with me. All my contact information is right here on screen.